everyone. I'm Elise Hand, and welcome to NSGov Talks, the podcast that takes you behind the scenes of the programs and people working to make a difference across Nova Scotia. It is our very first episode today, and we are focusing on a topic that impacted pretty much everyone this summer, wildfires. Historically, dry conditions made for a really dangerous wildfire season, and there were fires in parts of Nova Scotia that burned out of control, putting people and property at risk. Staff at the Department of Natural Resources, or DNR, were among the many Nova Scotians who worked tirelessly to get fires under control. My guest today is one of those people. Scott Tingley is the manager of forest protection with the Department of Natural Resources. Scott's team leads wildfire training, prevention, and response across Nova Scotia, and he brings many years of frontline experience from fighting fires in Alberta, BC, the Yukon, and of course right here at home in Nova Scotia. Hey, Scott, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Elise. Thanks for having me.
So glad you can be here, our very first guest. And of course, we thought it appropriate to talk about wildfires. We had a really active season. So let's start with the big picture. How would you describe this year's, or I guess we should say the summer's wildfire season in Nova Scotia?
Generally, yeah, it was one of our most severe, one of the longest kind of periods of drought we've seen in a fire season. Contrasted with 2023, we had another severe season that year. Big fires, big impacts on communities, but it was relatively short-lived. It was more of a short-lived spring fire season, so the fires kind of came quickly, but certainly had their impact. Whereas this summer, it just seemed to kind of go on and on and on, and we haven't seen that for a very, very long time in this province. So, very challenging here and right across the country.
How many wildfires? Let's go over the wildfires that did start here in Nova Scotia over the summer.
Yeah, so we've wrapped up the season with 179 fires in the book. So that's about average, maybe a little above average for a typical season in Nova Scotia. But it was the hectares that burned and how severe and how deep and how kind of impactful these fires were. Mm-hmm. And that's what we saw, was just the extreme drought. So we see things like, the roots of trees burning out and they're falling over in the wind and things like that. Just very, very severe. And again, we seem to see the seasons kind of extending either on the spring. This year it was extended into the fall, like well into the fall. We had an extended fire season, an extra month. Mm-hmm. The drought and the long-term drought was really the story of this season.
Let's talk about these fires you just spoke of. Susie's Lake Fire, of course, the Long Lake Fire in the Valley, among others. Are these fires officially out, Scott, or are they still? Is there still burning happening?
So the most high-profile fires, like you mentioned, so Susie Lake, that is extinguished. The Long Lake Fire was a little different story, much larger. It did burn a lot deeper and more severe, and there were some areas where it wasn't safe to send crews in and do that full extinguishment, full mop-up that we call it. And so that fire is still listed as under control, and we were, it was really going to be up to the weather on that one as to whether it was going to be fully extinguished. So crews are still monitoring that. We do know it is still burning in some areas, but we're confident with that fire that where it is burning, it's well within what we call the interior of the fire, and it's not at any risk of spreading.
How does the wildfire response system work here in Nova Scotia? Take us through that a little bit. So who gets called in first, and how do provincial and municipal teams all coordinate? It's a real effort, and it's interesting. It's like an orchestra, really. There's a lot of players involved, right?
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. For sure. So it starts with a wildfire detection. Most of the fires in Nova Scotia are detected through the public. We have people virtually everywhere. And like we said, most fires are started by human activity. So there's usually someone nearby, and they either see smoke or they see a fire, or they're aware it's happening. So they call 911, and a lot of times that's channeled, through the 911 system. And volunteer municipal fire departments obviously get those calls, and often are the first on scene in Nova Scotia. And then, so eventually, if there's a detection of something that's described as like a woods fire, a brush fire, the woods is on fire, that will get routed to the Provincial Wildfire Coordination Center in Shubenacadie. That's where I work. And then our staff help channel that information out to the local staff in the local DNR districts. And then those folks are the ones that are physically going out. We'll be at the end of the nozzle, putting the fire out, working with the municipal and volunteer fire departments. That's the detection element. We also use aerial detection. We have a contract with a fixed wing plane operator, and so they'll fly predetermined routes, based on the risk. So when the hazard's higher, we're flying more of those routes more often, and they'll spot the smoke from the air, and then they'll report it to the provincial fire center.
Let's bring into Nova Scotia Guard, which we heard a lot about over the summer. They were part of this effort. What was their role in this fire, and what did they do on the ground?
My understanding of the Guard is, like you said, there's lots of well-meaning, capable folks that want to help, and in the time that the emergencies are happening, sometimes the offers for help can kind of be a bit overwhelming and uncoordinated. So the Guard has provided a great avenue for people to kind of pre-register and be available. So for the Long Lake wildfire, for example, I know the Guard was called in to help with everything from, they were helping in the kitchen and getting meals prepared and packed and ready for the firefighters. They were helping move equipment on site, so as it was being delivered down to the fire staging area, they were helping kind of, be extra hands and help just kind of organizing things and like that. So they're taking direction from people at the fire site, but big help. So we appreciate all the offers for help, but again, that's where kind of channeling some of that help or those offers through, your various volunteer organizations, particularly the Guard, can help kind of organize those offers for help. And then when we need something, we have kind of one or two places to go and ask for it, and they'll match up the offer with what we need. So
you mentioned mutual aid a moment ago, and let's talk about that. That is, I assume, what you're referencing there, Scott, is your sort of contracts and your how you work with other provinces to fight fires. Can you talk to me a little bit more about how that works?
Yeah, for sure. We have various mutual aid agreements, internally and provincially, and then obviously we have. When we've kind of exhausted internal and provincial resources, we have options to go to one organization, the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, or CIFC. So that's our primary national mutual aid organization. We've had a mutual aid agreement for decades, and again, like you said, well-oiled machines. It's been refined over the years, and it's a very efficient way to it's incredible how quick you can order up firefighters, and they're showing up from British Columbia, Ontario, Quebec, and we know what types of resources are showing up. Everything's based on standards, and we know what we're going to be paying for them and things like that. So all the negotiations kind of done on the front end, and then when we need things, they can get here quickly and help us out.
Why does Nova Scotia only have helicopters? Why don't we have our own airplanes to fight wildfires?
The helicopters have been a very good fit for Nova Scotia for a long time. They're very versatile. Not only do they support the fire effort, but they support a lot of department work and intergovernmental work for the province. In terms of fires, they've met most of our needs over the years, and we've that's part of our operational risk assessment is when they haven't met our needs, when our needs are exceeded, beyond the 4 helicopters that we have, we do have these mutual aid agreements so we can get additional aircraft. The fixed wing water bombers certainly have a place, but we've found the helicopters be a very good fit to this point.
A lot of terms used over the summer, like dozer guards, Scott, and fire breaks. Tell me a little bit about those tactics, something we've heard a lot about over the summer, something we'll probably hear about more in the future. Yeah. What is a dozer guard? What is a fire break?
It's basic, so a dozer guard, is basically, we're using heavy equipment to create what we call as a fire break between maybe the fuel that's burning or just near the fuel that's burning, and then and the fuel is not burning. So we're basically, in a lot of cases, it looks like we're building a road, around the fire. And we're building that down, they're digging it down to what we call the bare mineral soil. And so that's, that's not going to catch on fire and let the fire spread. So that's going to limit the spread of the fire at a certain intensity level. I mean, once the fire's, when you see some of the more kind of exciting images of the fire, when there's big flames and it's up and rolling, there's a big column of smoke, there's not a lot of tactics that are going to slow something like that down. There are some tools to use, but those breaks are really meant to kind of buy firefighters time so they can go in and get on the ground and start extinguishing, the perimeter of the fire.
What about fire breaks? Same sort of idea?
Technically, you're building a break in a sense with dropping water from the air. So some of the fixed wing water bombers will use a fire retardant, and as opposed to like a water or a foam. And so that retardant, that's the kind of the red, stuff that they see dropping out of the plane, and they might try to put a few lines of that ahead of the fire, and it's meant to kind of do just as it's called. It's meant to retard the spread of the fire, so it's meant to slow it down. So it kind of coats the vegetation ahead of the fire. And breaks can also be created by hand crews. When crews are down on the ground, they'll use tools like Pulaskis and shovels, just on a smaller scale than like a bulldozer, so they can dig away. And same principle, they're just trying to remove fuel from the advancing fire to the fuel that hasn't burned yet.
And those are, relatively complex, I guess you could say that, techniques where they take labor and effort. But, I know a big part of fighting fire, and will always be a big part of it, is just something as simple as, a sprinkler system. How effective were things like sprinkler systems in saving homes and protecting properties with the wildfires we saw in Nova Scotia over the summer?
Yeah, this summer they saw a lot of success using sprinkler systems. Sprinklers can be used in a couple different ways. The biggest story of these fires, the most effective use, was doing actual protection around homes and other values. So there was some communication towers, there was a church, community center, things like that. So they're literally just setting up kind of industrial sized sprinklers, not much different than what you'd see, you use around your home, but just a little different design. So they were able to save dozens of homes, particularly down in that West Dalhousie Road in that area when the Long Lake fire was advancing. They had a lot of success there. We certainly had some losses, and that was devastating for everybody, but they were able to save a lot of homes.
So that sprinkler system is something as basic as a sprinkler.
Yeah.
You don't need big technology, right, to have an impact. That's interesting. What does government do, Scott, DNR specifically? What are they doing now ahead of the next wildfire season in terms of planning to reduce wildfire risk?
So this is a 12-month year, operation for us, So the fire season is the fire risk season. That's typically when we get fires.
And remind us when that season is too.
Yeah, that's so March 15th to October 15th. The department is active on lots of working groups, and whether it be national or international, we're staying in touch with the latest developments in technology and methods and things like that. And so we're always constantly evaluating, what would be good for Nova Scotia and what we should be investing in. So a lot of that work is starting this year, or this time of year. And with a lot of those working groups and collaborations, this is the time where we're often meeting. I was just in Newfoundland last week meeting with my counterparts from all the provinces and Parks Canada Agency across Canada, and we're doing as a group, as we do here internally, we're reviewing how the season went, and what went well, what can we do to improve, and things like that. So that's kind of what's going on a lot of this part of the season, and then after Christmas we kind of switch into getting ready again. March 15th is always around the corner for us, so we're always getting ready. Yeah.
What are some simple but effective steps people watching today, and municipalities too? Let's bring them into the fold as well. What can we do to reduce wildfire risks?
We always direct people to Fire Smart Canada. There's lots of it's a great program with lots of great information, a lot of simple tips people can start. There's some training people can take as well. Just learning the basics about hazard assessment, looking around your home, around your community, assessing what the risks are, putting plans in place to mitigate those risks, and then implementing those plans. So simple things like, keeping 1.5 meters around your home free of combustibles. Simple things like keeping your lawn, mowed and cleared. Again, just one less kind of fuel source to kind of carry a fire to your home and your garage and things like that might be on the property. Municipalities and communities and towns and things like that. There's, again, lots of practical things that can be done. And again, it's the same principles, at the home owner community level. It's doing hazard assessments, having wildfire built into planning, preparedness, plans. That's the kind of the key is communities to have a plan. What are they going to do when a wildfire happens, and what can they do to prevent them? So.
Yeah. Saw a lot of those plans in action this summer, especially in the valley. A lot of municipalities work closely with you to make sure that people are getting information, and it was great to see that happening. The BurnSafe map. Let's quickly touch on that. We're just about to wrap up here, Scott. But who and what goes into deciding those restrictions on the BurnSafe map? And maybe just for those who might be new to Nova Scotia or not aware, what is the BurnSafe map as well?
So the BurnSafe map is a system, so we've got a website and a phone number people can call each day. It's updated every day at 2 p.m. and it'll advise people whether it's safe to burn at 2 p.m., 7 p.m. or not at all. And then there's never any burning permitted in Nova Scotia between 8 a.m. and 2 p.m. What is it? It was a system and a tool designed. We've got a team of folks at the Provincial Fire Centre, they specialize on analyzing our fire data and understanding, fire risk, in terms of, the fire weather indices, at kind of what levels do we have challenging fires, things like that. So some thresholds were kind of designed and identified to set those restrictions. And then it's the responsibility of the provincial duty officer who works at the Provincial Fire Centre each day. So that position staffs 7 days a week during the fire season. And they've got some decision aids that they use, but ultimately, they're looking at the fire risk and assigning that by county as to whether people can burn. So check every day at 2 p.m. And you'll know. So
what are the most reliable sources for information during a wildfire season?
Certainly, any of our, our NSGov social media, the BurnSafe website, obviously, we want people checking there regularly. The Alert Ready and any local channels that are coming through, municipalities and their local officials and things like that. And people can always visit their local Department of Natural Resource office. There's one in every county, and you visit and stop in, talk to the wildfire folks there. And
we've got, of course, at NSGov, make sure to give us a follow. We've been really busy. I can speak for so many members of our team. Scott, we were in touch with you all summer too, talking to media, giving them updates every day as to what was happening. So I certainly learned a lot about wildfires this season. And I just wanted, while I have you here, thank you so much for the work you did. I know you worked tirelessly, you and so many others with DNR. It was one for the books. So we thank you for keeping all of us safe. I'm sure I'm speaking for all Nova Scotians when I say that. Does this mean, I know we talked about it earlier, Scott, but do you get to have a little bit of a rest now, or, what do you do in your sort of off season? We talked a little bit about it. We talked about how you of course, you're preparing for the year ahead. Yeah. What about, what does Scott like to do when he's not at work? What is your day to day? You've got kids, right?
Yeah, I've got a couple of young kids. They keep us busy. We're into hockey and dance and things like that. So, keeping connected with the family and keeping grounded and keep that way. I'm into sports. Swim, I bike, and try to keep active. It's important to kind of not get too entrenched in what we do, but basically, there's a few of us. This is our job year round, so it depends on what you define by break. We're always thinking about it. Again, this is our job. We're on 12 months a year. We don't really take a break. We're just not fighting fires right now, but if we're not fighting them, we're getting prepared and getting ready for them. So
I hope you get a little time to unwind, and thank you. You've been so busy, but you've still managed to make some time for us to chat on the podcast. Our very first guest. Hey. Thanks for being here, Scott.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
You bet. Take care.